Hello everyone, if you did watch my latest video, I did say that we have a lot to talk about today, and to that point, we do have a second video for you tonight. So I wanted to do a more in-depth discussion about the federal funding freeze that happened over the last day or so, and really talk about the consequences long term. Like we touched on in my last video, a lot of people I think are feeling very comfortable now, despite all the chaos that happened over the last day or so, because the White House has since turned around and rescinded some of their statements in a memo regarding the federal funding freeze. But I don't want people to get too comfortable because while they've rescinded some statements, the actual actions that have been taken remain the same for the most part. So, again, while things are being challenged in court, we need to talk about all the things that have been put on the chopping block because of the funding freeze and the risk that that poses to millions and millions of America. You have a lot of different funding that goes through so many different agencies that keep Americans afloat. And we're not just talking about people that are on things like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Yes, those are very important safety nets for the American people, especially those that are less fortunate than others. But there are some very widespread programs that receive government funding that really just keep the country afloat and make things affordable for a lot of people. So, that being said, the obvious ones are the ones that we just mentioned: Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And the big thing is that Trump did come out since and say, well, no, we're not really touching those things, despite the fact that they were paused for some time. You may be aware that yesterday and the day prior, there was so much confusion. Medicaid was not accessible at all. And this is not just for those that are not able to afford health insurance. This is also what's supporting those that are disabled and those that are older, things of that nature. So these people were very, very scared, as it was very uncertain that day if their benefits were going to be cut off permanently. And while that is a particular area that the Trump administration has turned around and said they want to leave alone, there were dozens of other agencies that were affected by the federal funding freeze that they did not go back and say that they want to leave alone. So I can remember a lot off the top of my head, but not all of this. So I do have a little of a list for you that I'm going to read off, and we'll touch on some of the areas that would be affected by this, just to give you an idea to think about your day-to-day life, the day-to-day life of the people that are around you every day, so you can have an understanding of how large an impact that could have. So, some of the examples are beyond the ones that we talked about. Meals on Wheels, you're likely familiar, the service that helps feed elderly people, immunocompromised people that are perhaps at risk of danger if they leave the house on a regular basis and opt to stay indoors. This is an important program that was cut off. You have addiction services, veteran homelessness programs, Head Start, which is a major part of preschool funding and helping make sure that especially parents that are less fortunate are able to make sure that their children get that basic level of education just going through preschool. Head Start plays a strong role in that. You had SNAP that was put on the chopping block. The Trump administration has turned around and said that they're going to leave SNAP benefits active for now to try and take away from some of that panic. But long term, this is not something that they're going to leave alone. So, you have food stamps and benefits that allow people to put food on the table. That's at risk as well. Child nutrition programs that go through school, if you're not already aware, and that's the healthy side of it. But just generally speaking, this administration does not support free school and free lunch for, free school breakfast and free school lunch for public education. They don't support that. So these programs are also at risk. If you have a child or know a child that goes to public school, which the vast majority of Americans do, this would prevent them from having federally funded meals, whether they're healthy or not. You're talking about going back to a situation where parents are then responsible for that as well, just in a financial sense. You have college grants that were affected, child and maternal health grants that were affected for when maternity leave is needed, even just emergency health care for children, whereas it wouldn't otherwise be afforded. These grants are being made unavailable as well. You have crazy stuff like lead reduction efforts, clean water efforts. These are federally funded programs, and the funds were cut off for these as well. It's really unclear whether they'll be returning or not, particularly long term or in the near future. Section 8, that's a huge deal. That was the funding for that was cut off as well. Hospital grants, you have such a wide area of things that were affected here. You're talking about areas from healthcare to putting food on the table to child education, elder care, all of addiction services, all of these things being put on the chopping block just because the Trump administration turns around and says, no, we want to leave Medicaid or Medicare alone. These are all the things that they said that they are not taking these off the table. You have to consider how many millions of Americans benefit from these programs, and you talk about cutting costs. Again, this is the exact opposite of that. You're going to see if any of these things aren't reinstated long term, these will increase prices for Americans dramatically. You're going to see a lot of things like preschool is a good example of particular that people just won't be able to afford. These things will be very, very challenging for Americans. So something to keep your eye on. If you weren't aware, during not just the federal funding freeze, but even when Trump before that had directed the end of research for certain medical issues like cancer, these actually halted treatments for people that receive treatment via clinical trials because these are government funded programs, and this is kind of a way where you can do treatment and research in one fell swoop. So that's kind of the purpose of clinical trials, and the funding for these were cut off as well. So you had people that were expecting and awaiting treatment in these senses that weren't able to proceed with them. Very, very dangerous, putting people's health at risk. It's very concerning. And then you can move on to FEMA, the Federal Environmental, that's that agency that you've seen them working right now in North Carolina, in California with the wildfires, and then the hurricanes down south, things of that nature. They've been under fire a lot by the Trump administration, which we can have the conversation of whether or not you think all the funds are allocated in an appropriate way and whether you think the job is being done effectively. But I do believe that it's undeniable that these agencies are very important. These are the agencies that respond, in addition to other agencies like the Red Cross and things of that nature, which also lost funding. They're being put in a real predicament here when we have so many natural disasters taking place where their hands are kind of tied because they're having their funding taken away as well. And then Trump is really planning to take this up to the higher courts because really the funding that he's taken away from them and some of the actions that he's taken are illegal as well. But the plan is for it to go to the higher courts because one of Trump's goals is to abolish FEMA entirely. If he is able to accomplish that, he'll be in a position where he can kind of hold different states hostage with their federal emergency relief. California would be a good example, where if you didn't see his visit recently, he did go to California to witness the destruction left by the wildfires, but he made some accusations that were inaccurate. He tried to claim that there are these reserves of water within California that are just not being utilized to fight the wildfires, which is just blatantly untrue. These reservoirs that he claims exist and are not being used don't exist. They're using everything that they have, and there were scenarios where, with the high winds and things that were taking place with the wildfires, that wasn't even the best direction to go, but the claims are still false. And so one of the things that he says is that he wants to provide relief to California, but only under these conditions. That was one of the conditions, that they release these water valves, which can't be done. It's kind of a fake condition because he knows they won't be able to accomplish it because they don't exist. He coupled that with the requirement to to enforce these voter ID laws in California, which is just a play to it's voter suppression to try and make things easier for the Republican Party to win in California. because voter ID, it's not as if ID and registrations aren't being checked when people go to vote, but they're trying to really crack down on these laws and make it harder to register to vote, to make it so that more paperwork is required to vote. And then, you turn up at the voting booth and all of a sudden, depending on who you are, because that is how it works, not everybody is held to the same standard. They can say, well, you don't have this or that, and so you need to go home, collect these documents that you may or may not have, and then come back to the voting booth. So regardless of what you think of the conditions, I think the concept of conditional aid is unethical at face value. It doesn't make sense when a state is going through these crises to withhold aid in any circumstance. Especially if you're the president, your top priority should be to make sure that the funding is there, to make sure that the citizens of whatever state you're in get relief no matter what. What you're looking at long term going this direction is a situation where he can say, well, maybe Mississippi gets all the federal funding that they need for disaster relief. Florida does as well. But California, I'm not really liking the way that you guys do things. So if you want this relief, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And that's just a dangerous game because whatever the conditions are, we are not in a position to deny federal emergency aid to anyone who's going through these circumstances. The wildfires would be a perfect example of that. To withhold aid from people that need to rebuild their homes and the state in general, particularly Los Angeles, is frankly unethical. So these are more things that I want you guys to keep in mind, just the broad area of things that could be slashed and cut off because of the federal funding freeze. And just think about this as time goes on. Think about where you want the money to go and ask the question, are we having a conversation about where the money is going to go? If we take it away from all of these programs, what are we putting it into? That hasn't been discussed yet. That remains to be seen. You can only imagine that it would go to the things that haven't been discussed yet, which are like the military. I'm sure they'll try to funnel a lot of money into that and foreign aid to Israel because these are some of the only things that they've specified won't be affected by this, aside from Medicaid and Medicare, which we know they want to slash in other ways. That's only a matter of time. So, a lot to talk about. The second video just covering that in-depth discussion, and I hope you take some information away from it. Thank you for watching again. I hope you guys have a good night. This will be it for me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.